For this podcast, I've read the book House of Bush, House of Saud, and in the book, it is explored to see what links the Bush family has to the Saud royal family and what their combined links might be to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Starting with what was most apparent on the day of September 11th, there are anomalies surrounding the bin Laden family and the Saudi royals. In the wake of the attacks, there was an initial grounding of all flights in the United States, whether it be commercial or private. However, the FBI would coordinate with the Saudi consulate to enable the bin Laden family and the Saudi family to travel freely and ultimately make their exit from the country, along with many other Saudi nationals who were in the country. Prince Bandar, who was the nephew to King Fahd and the son of the defense minister, and also acting as ambassador to the United States, would play a key role in organizing the exodus. For some reason, the FBI would try to deny any role in enabling their exodus, despite the position that was needed to make it happen. The Saudi relationship with the United States dates back to 1945, when under the Roosevelt administration, the two countries forged an alliance. The Saudis needed military protection, and the United States needed oil, of which the Sauds had plenty of. However, the Saudis were able to hold on to power throughout the decades because they were aligned with Wahhabi fundamentalists in the country, so they needed to strike a balance between the United States and their allegiance to Wahhabism, which served as a breeding ground for radicalism in the Muslim world. One family that was particularly close to the Saudi royals was the bin Laden family, which would become wealthy in the construction field, building many state-sponsored projects. Throughout the 1970s, the US would reap the benefits from buying cheap oil from the Sauds, while US companies sold defense weapons to the Saudis. Much like the royal family, the bin Laden family would seek to cultivate relationships with those politically influential and do business with those people, as well as companies like Citigroup, Merrill Lynch, and Goldman Sachs. Throughout the 1990s, the bin Ladens would do business with James Baker, whose family was involved in banking, and provided the CIA with cover jobs. The bin Ladens would also make investments with the Carlyle Group, which James Baker had an association with. Along with oil for security, the relationship between the countries also assisted the two countries. Saudi Arabia would assist in many operations spearheaded by the CIA, and Bandar would end up cultivating relationships with the Bush family throughout the 1970s. In 1974, an individual by the name of James Bath, who had connections to George W. Bush, was involved with the sale of passenger jets and would make the acquaintance with Salam bin Laden, the eldest son of Mohammed Awad bin Laden. They would end up forming a relationship because Salam had an aircraft to sell and James already had a buyer in mind. Through Salam, James Bath would end up meeting and befriending Khalid bin Mahfouz, who was the son of the founder of the bank named the National Commercial Bank of Saudi Arabia. In the 1970s, the bin Ladens and the Mahfouz family were becoming fixtures in the Houston area, and the bin Mahfouz family would end up purchasing real estate that was relatively close to James Bath. Also a frequent visitor to the Houston area was a well-known arms dealer by the name of Adnan Khashoggi. With the formation of OPEC, they had the ability to control oil prices through the amount of which they produced, and it had become quite a weapon for countries who were able to produce it. With Houston being heavily involved in oil production, many of the petrodollars would make its way to Texas Commerce Bank, which was founded by the Baker family, who had links to the Bush family, along with the fact that the bank provided cover stories of employment for CIA agents. While Saudi Arabia began to grow due to its oil production, it was still lacking the infrastructure and was vulnerable to both foreign and domestic invasions. With the US and Saudi Arabia having a mutually beneficial relationship in oil production, and as consumption grew, wealth would pour into the Houston area from Saudi Arabia, and there would be billions that would get invested into American companies. As they made financial investments, the House of Saud would also cement relationships with the right people who were connected to politics. Under the Carter administration, Burt Lance, who was the CEO of the National Bank of Georgia, would get appointed to the director of the Office of Management and Budget. But Lance would resign from this over a stock scandal in which he had taken out a loan to purchase stock in the bank he worked at. So Lance was looking for a buyer of the bank because he wanted to get out of his stock. Lance would soon meet Aga Hassan Abidi, who was the founder of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, which was reaping the benefit of the petrodollars. With Lance wanting to sell his stock he had purchased, he set out to convince Abidi that the U.S. was a market he should think of getting into. But he would steer Lance towards Gath Pharaoh to take over the Bank of Georgia. And it would be Pharaoh who would set in motion a strategy of Saudi Arabian banks taking over American banks. And this would be the entree for BCCI going into the US market. And many BCCI officials would meet Jimmy Carter and others politically connected to him and the administration. In 1976, Salam bin Laden would appoint James Bath as his business representative, and Khalid bin Mahfouz would do the same. In the 1970s, it was always Saudi Arabia's goal to forge alliances with those who had the potential to win political office so they could reap the financial gain through these political relationships. So they had set their sights on George H. Bush to cultivate a relationship. In 1978, George H. Bush was beginning to assess his political future, having made substantial contacts in the oil industry and the CIA, where both sources of the contacts served each other's interests in the name of national security. Given the fact that Turner, who was the CIA director under Carter, had laid off many CIA agents, those who currently were employed by the CIA and formerly employed by them would have leanings towards George H. Bush. Meanwhile, the bin Mahfouz family was involved in banking, and they would form an allegiance with James Baker, whose family had ties to the Bush family. And they also ran coverage for the CIA and all their money laundering needs, and they would provide cover jobs for CIA agents. In 1979, Anwar Sadat of Egypt signed a historic peace agreement known as the Camp David Peace Accords with Israel, and the Muslim Brotherhood would not be too happy with this arrangement. And 9 months after Reagan had taken office, the Muslim Brotherhood would have him assassinated. With Saudi Arabia acting as a conduit for the flow of money and arms on the behest of the CIA. The CIA would hope to have deniability for anything that went wrong in that region. When it came to dealing with Iran and Iraq, the Reagan administration was more partial to Iran, but they would end up arming both sides of the conflict. Because so many countries in the Middle East were oil producers, the US would learn what happens when they sided with Israel too much. So, at the heart of diplomatic relationships in that region was oil, given the fact that oil was declared as of national security interests. Given the fact that Bandar had cultivated a friendship with George H. Bush and he would secure the sale of 5 AWACS to Saudi Arabia, he would get rewarded with an appointment as ambassador to the United States, and this would be the start of a relationship where Saudi Arabia would build military facilities to sustain the US military if protection was needed in the area. Naturally, it would be the bin Laden group that would get the contracts to build these facilities. Given the fact that Congress wasn't going to approve every covert operation the CIA wanted to pursue, the CIA would partner with Saudi intelligence to pursue covert operations while hoping to have complete deniability, and Prince Bandar would be at the heart of these covert operations. In the Reagan administration, there was a split between who to align with when it came to Iran and Iraq. Those who felt Iran was a greater threat and could cause a spread of Islamic fundamentalism consisted of Caspar Weinberg and George Shultz, who were likely propagandized by Saudi Arabia. And who would ever question Saudi Arabia since they were involved in much of the covert operations with the CIA and had leverage in the form of information? There would also be the fact that in 1982, Israel would sell arms to Iran. When it came to funding the Nicaraguan Contras, the CIA would use Saudi Arabia to fund them financially, as well as enabling the drug sales through the cartels and the Nicaraguan Contras. Throughout the turmoil in the Middle East, Iran's modus operandi would be to take hostages and to demand arms to fight off their invaders. And this would be their strategy, given the fact that they had an embargo on them. Because of the twisted manner in doing diplomacy in this region, the US would need Iran to need more arms to get hostages out, so they would need to have Iran feeling under threat, so they would have to allow Saudi Arabia to sell arms and bombs to Iraq to create this threat. Because the Saudi Arabians were intertwined with the CIA, they would gravitate towards using BCCI as the go-to bank for funding terrorists and shipping arms. The original founder of the bank was Pakistani, and many Saudi Arabians would become investors in BCCI. With BCCI getting comfortable with their being used as a financial conduit for the sale of arms, it would continue to enable the flow of arms and money to Iraq, even though the war between Iraq and Iran had ended in a stalemate. Such arms that went to Iraq would be provided by Sarkis Soghalian. Rather than putting a stop to it, George H. Bush would adopt policies to aid Iraq to appease this oil-producing country. Some of the aid money would go towards building infrastructure to produce more oil, while some of the money would go to building facilities to produce chemical weapons. At the root of Saudi Arabia's survival on the domestic front is the partnership with Wahhabism, which is derived from the Prophet Ibn al Wahhab. With the Sauds gained legitimacy from Wahhabism, the Wahhabism following was able to flourish with the production of the Saud family. So there was a mutual beneficial relationship between the two parties. Those who were devoted to the religious sect were expected to contribute a zakat, or a tax, to the leader of the religious community. And it was also expected they would defend the honor of their religion, making Saudi Arabia a theocracy. And the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad were thought of as their constitution. The difference in Wahhabism and other Muslim believers was the interpretation of the word jihad. According to the Quran, it referred to as a duty outside the individual to enjoin good and forbid evil, whereas Muslims outside the sect thought of jihad as an inner conflict in oneself to rid oneself of immorality. Based on these two interpretations of jihad, I would have to say the Saud family subscribed to the Quran's interpretation, as they seem to fall short on the morality front. As Saudi Arabia expanded its base of wealth through oil production, they were tasked with the need to modernize, but didn't want to become too westernized. Back home in the US, the public was kept in the dark about Wahhabism, and it was partially due to the investments Saudi Arabia made into media conglomerates to have control over the narrative. Aramco, the Arab American consortium, which would also have their hand in shaping the public's perception, given the fact that oil had become very lucrative for the Houston economy and the economy as a whole. By 1979, the Muslim Brotherhood felt as though the Sauds lost their legitimacy because they were not pious enough, and they had got too wrapped up in the extravagant lifestyle oil money had brought them. With the Muslim Brotherhood losing respect for the Sauds, they would stage a revolt against the House of Saud. After this attempted uprising, the Benel Corporation would get involved in training the Saudi troops and the guards that protect the royal family. With the Saud family having close connections to both the Bush family and the Bin Laden family, and the Bin Ladens having ties to the Bush family, the trio sought out mutually beneficial relationships to reap financial gains. Because of the mutually beneficial relationship, George H. Bush was inclined to support the Mujahideen to fight off the Soviet Union, which would morph into Al Qaeda, and they would end up having links to a Brooklyn mosque because so many people were allowed to immigrate into the US. And this mosque would have links to the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center. Despite the anti-Western sentiment the Mujahideen had, the CIA would have to look the other way to this since they were so vital in fighting off the Soviet Union. With so many charities being set up to act as intermediaries to support the Mujahideen, the National Commercial Bank of Saudi Arabia was handling most of the money transactions, which went to Al Qaeda. And the Bin Mahfouz family had become one of the biggest investors in BCCI. Looking to take over a debt-ridden company by the name of Harkin Energy, which was owned in part by the Bush family, BCCI would take it over for the value of political capital tied to the Bush family name. As money began to be invested into the financially struggling Harkin Energy, in which most of the money came from those with connections to BCCI, Harkin would land a drilling rights contract off the coast of Bahrain. But even with this drilling prospect, Harkin would continue to struggle financially, and they would end up spinning off a division to avoid bankruptcy. And George W. Bush would sell his stock in Harkin Energy, and he would move on to making investments into the Texas Rangers baseball team. With investments being made into Bush owned companies, they would return the favor with policy shifts, allowing people such as Abdullah Bakshish, who sat on the board of Harkin Energy, to sit on meetings regarding policy in the Middle East. In 1992, a Senate led investigation into BCCI's influence over policy matters was conducted, and it would be concluded that while Robert Mueller was acting tough on BCCI, he was really obstructing the investigation, that they intentionally did not investigate BCCI for money laundering, which would be a fine example of how the Justice Department runs coverage for criminal syndicate members that are on their team. In the spring of 1990, Saddam hinted at his disdain towards Israel, and at the same time, he was building up his chemical weapons while receiving intel from the United States. Given the fact that Saddam had always had a dispute over Kuwait, over where the land boundaries were, pertaining to an oil rich region, this would be one issue that sealed Iraq's fate, since Saddam could not resist an invasion into Kuwait. Because the Bush family had a soft spot for Kuwait, given the fact that Zapata Oil had received oil rights contracts from the country, Kuwait would win diplomatic favor from the Bush family, despite the fact that Bandar had contempt for Kuwait. So to pull off the support for Kuwait, George H. Bush would have to tell Saudi Arabia that the Iraqis were building up troops on the Saudi border and were planning an attack. In 1992, while Bush Sr. was still in office, Paul Wolfowitz would draft a policy known as the Defense Planning Guidance, and this policy draft would come to light later in the George W. Bush administration. In the policy outline was a vision of unilateral military action to minimize the disruptions of oil supply, irrespective of how our ally, Saudi Arabia, felt about it. And don't forget the fact that Islamic extremism was flourishing with the assistance of Saudi Arabia as they fueled so many charities. Given the fact that Saudi Arabia consulted with Osama bin Laden about the US occupation in Saudi Arabia to fight Iraq, Osama would assert warnings to Saudi Arabia that there would be backlash amongst all Muslims if the US were to be allowed to occupy territory that was held sacred by Muslims. And King Fahd would also get rebuffed from Islamic clerics who oversaw the judiciary in the country, and they would call into question the family's legitimacy. For many in the Islamic religion, they would not be able to reconcile how Iraq was a bigger threat than having to accept the Western ideology, and it was a deal breaker that the US would occupy land in Saudi Arabia, which many considered a reason for jihad against infidels, that being the US. Because the Saud royal family began to feel threatened by Osama's popularity, they would end up forcing the bin Ladens out of the country. After being forced out of Saudi Arabia, Osama would find refuge in Pakistan and Sudan. On December 29th in 1992, a random terror attack would start with an attack in Yemen on a hotel. There would also be an attack on U.S. soil where the World Trade Center would be bombed and attacked by Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman. With bin Laden inspired attacks starting to occur more frequently, the bin Laden family would disassociate themselves from Osama. In 1987, the Carlyle Group was formed by an individual by the name of David Rubenstein, and he would implement a private equity strategy of attracting those who were politically connected to the firm. Directors of the company would consist of George H. Bush, James Baker, John Major, Frank Carlucci, and Richard Dorman. And George W. Bush would also serve as a director at one point in time. Because Carlucci was the defense secretary, he would focus on taking over defense companies, given the fact that he made connections with people in the private world as well as people in the federal government. At one point in time, Carlyle would buy BDM, which was a military consulting firm, which would buy the Benel Corporation, which had connections to training the Saudi military. While Rubenstein would try to claim there was no personal relationship between Carlyle Group and Saudi Arabia, there would be clear links that would suggest otherwise. Between investments Saudi Arabia made into the Carlyle Group and the defense contractors that the Carlyle Group was buying up to sell military weaponry to Saudi Arabia, there was that clear link of benefit between the two parties. By 1995, the bin Laden family was also making investments into the Carlyle Group. With the Bush family and other close associates of the Bush family cashing in on a relationship with Saudi Arabia and the Carlyle Group, Bill Clinton would end up receiving resistance to crack down on Osama bin Laden for reasons of politics and financial gain on the part of the Bush family. In the wake of the random terrorist attacks backed by Osama bin Laden, much of the money to fund him and his supporters would flow through charities set up by the bin Mahfouz family, which founded the National Commercial Bank of Saudi Arabia. Contrasting how Bill Clinton dealt with Iraq, he was a bit more dovish when the neocons would have preferred him to be more hawkish. Bill Clinton chose to deal with Iraq in a more tempered manner, having pursued the occasional bombing here and there to ensure a level of containment. As his term was nearing an end, George W. Bush was gearing up for a run. His brother Jeb, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, and Richard Pearl were on board with the New American Century policy, which called for war with Iraq and Saddam's removal, which is quite different than George H. Bush's policy towards Iraq, in which he enabled their buildup. While being pro-Israel, this policy initiative also wanted to instill American principles and interests throughout the region, which all flew in the face of Islam and their wanting to keep out infidels from the Holy Lands. So basically, the policy was intended to poke a hornet's nest while they were simultaneously estimating that it would take an event like Pearl Harbor to act as a catalyst to set the strategy in motion. Knowing they were implementing a policy to stir up a hornet's nest, this would not stop the Bush family from reaping financial gains through corporate interests that had to do with providing defense to Saudi Arabia or expansion of oil rights. Given the fact that oil was of national security and central to the economy, this would be very profitable. Yet they would ignore the growing Islamic extremism throughout the region. Again, the Saudis saw this as a domestic issue, while the US saw it differently and sought out more interventionist policies to overreach and encroach upon Islamic territories, which would create more friction. Of all the mosques throughout the United States, 80% of them subscribe to Wahhabism. And many of the Muslim charities that were controlled had followers of Wahhabism. Meanwhile, George W. Bush was receptive to gaining endorsements from Muslim groups in his quest to win the presidency. So he would seek out the founder of the American Muslim Council, and his name was Abdurham Alamudi, and he also played a role in creating the Institute of Islamic and Arabic Sciences to train soldiers and civilians to provide spiritual guidance when chaplains were not available to do so. In March of 2000, George W. would meet with Sami al-Arian, who would end up supporting and campaigning for George W. But for whatever reason, his ties to individuals regarding the 1993 World Trade Center bombing would be overlooked. And it would also be overlooked that he was investigated over his associations with people with links to Islamic Jihad. If just having links to those individuals who support Islamic Jihad are enough to be investigated over, shouldn't the Bush family have been investigated over their ties to the Saudi government, given the fact that they allowed Islamic Wahhabism to spread? Despite having advisors who were hawkish on Iraq, George W. Bush would end up courting the Muslim Americans who had influence over the Electoral College in Florida and Michigan. And this would be achieved by the assistance of Muslim charities that were funded by Saudi Arabia. As the transition to the George W. Bush administration took place, Sandy Berger would warn Bush of the risk that al-Qaeda posed given the number of attacks that had been sponsored by the group. While being presented with the threat of al-Qaeda and the possibilities of how to deal with the threat, the Bush administration was looking to reward donors with key positions to have say over what policies were pursued. On January 19th, the Baker Botts law firm would throw a party for the elder Bush and Prince Bandar, and there was the expectation that the new Bush administration would ease up on the Muslim threat concern, since Bush had gotten elected with the support of the Electoral College from key states like Florida and Michigan. Among those who were clients of Baker and Botts were the Carlyle Group and Halliburton Energy, which had ties to Dick Cheney. With Halliburton wanting to open up an office in Tehran, Iran, the Bush administration began a shift in policy to be less restrictive towards Libya, Iran, and Iraq. One would have to assume that they threw Iraq on the list of consideration to offset any favoritism suspicions. Being that Cheney and Rumsfeld were both part of the project of a new vision for America, this would officially make them hawkish on Iraq. On February 7th, George Tenet would give congressional testimony stating that Osama bin Laden and his terrorist networks were an imminent threat to the United States. For whatever reason, the Bush administration was not willing to take military action against the camps in Afghanistan. In March of 2000, the Italian government was picking up intel from Al-Qaeda agents who were in Milan, Italy, regarding some kind of very secret plan that was to be directed at the United States. And in April, the FAA issued warnings to airlines regarding possible hijacking attempts by Middle Eastern terrorists. Being disconnected from the sense that terrorism was a threat, Colin Powell in May would announce the intent to give the Taliban $43 million given their stance against drug trafficking. Let's not forget how it was the Reagan administration that thought they could put cocaine trafficking on the Sandinistas and not the Contras and the CIA, who were in bed with each other while getting assistance from Saudi Arabia. At the same time, Prince Bandar was hoping to assist the Palestinians in reaching peace. So knowing now how Israel feels about achieving peace amongst the Palestinians and Israel, it is conceivable that they could have coordinated an adjacent plan to put an end to the Palestinian peace process, which was getting the backing by Prince Bandar. While you keep in mind how they may have sought to achieve their goals, keep in mind that the Mossad has been known for passing their agents off as being CIA agents to pursue the goals of the Mossad. This is true in at least one instance in which Mossad agents passed themselves off as CIA agents to turn Pakistan against Iran. On July 5th, Richard Clarke was prepping the federal agencies of there being a potential attack on the United States. In the Pentagon, Rumsfeld held the position that counterterrorism was not a real concern for the Pentagon, while at the same time he was on board for the New America plan. That was the brainchild of Paul Wolfowitz, which called for a hawkish stand on Iraq. To be hawkish on Iraq, they would need a catalyst, like a Pearl Harbor type attack. With the CIA having allowed so many jihadis to immigrate into the US because they once fought our enemy, they were warning the immigration services of their presence, and they never envisioned a great threat on their part because they thought to notify the immigration services and not the FBI. On September 11th of 2001, there would be the anomaly of the fact that the Carlyle Group would hold a meeting in Washington, D.C., and those present for the meeting were James Baker, Frank Carlucci, and Shafiq bin Laden. After the attacks occurred, George W. Bush, along with Colin Powell, would portray an effort to crack down on 27 individuals and entities who were proven to have funneled money to terrorists. and they would praise the Saudi government for their cooperation in taking on this threat of terrorism. Yet the Saudis would deny the US from using Saudi land as a staging ground for attacks. When one of the terrorists was captured by the name of Zubeydeh, he would offer up a telephone number to a royal Saudi to prove the Saudi connection to the attacks, and he would claim that the Saudi government made a deal with Al Qaeda to aid the Taliban in exchange for Al Qaeda keeping any jihadi attacks out of Saudi Arabia. He would also claim that Prince Ahmad knew of the planned attack in advance. He would also claim that Prince Sultan bin Faisal bin Turki al Saud had knowledge as well. Interestingly, these two princes would die under suspicious circumstances. Prince Ahmad would die of a heart attack in his sleep, and Prince Sultan would die in a one-way car crash en route to Ahmad's funeral. And a third prince by the name of Saud bin Turki bin Saud al-Kabir, who was also named by Zubeydeh, would die of thirst in the desert. As the saying goes, dead men can tell no tales, and it's undetermined whether these suspicious deaths are to be portrayed as an attempt in retaliation, as to portray shock, or whether it was just to clean up loose strings so nothing else could ever be found out. So those are the links that the Sauds and the Bushes have to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And thank you for listening.